morning they told Maren Holt she had 3 days to leave, the sky was the color of a bruise. She was standing at the kitchen window when her uncle came in from the cold, stomping snow off his boots the way he always did. Hard, impatient, like the floor owed him something. He didn't sit down. He stood near the doorway and said it plain. The property had been assessed, the debts were real, and the county men were coming Friday. He said it the way a man says something he rehearsed. So many times it stopped feeling cruel. Maren didn't answer right away. She looked out the window at the bare cottonwood at the edge of the yard, its branches holding snow the way tired arms hold something heavy. She had lived in this house for 11 years. She came to it at 22, after her mother died of fever the autumn of 1881, carrying 2 trunks and a letter from her mother's older brother, a man named Roy Fenwick, who had written to say she was welcome to work for her keep. She had cooked and mended and hauled water and cut cordwood and done every task that needed doing, and she had never once asked Roy Fenwick for wages, because she understood the arrangement, and she was not a woman who confused arrangement for affection. But she had believed, she had let herself believe, that 11 years of work counted for something. "Friday," she said. "Friday," Roy said. He looked at a spot on the wall behind her. "There's a family in Caldwell might take you on. Housekeeper. I can write them." She told him she didn't need him to write anyone. He left. She heard his boots on the porch, then the silence that follows when someone goes back to their own life and leaves you standing in the wreckage of yours. The debts were real. She'd known that much. Roy Fenwick had borrowed against the land 3 years running, dry seasons on dry seasons, and the creditors had finally stopped being patient. The house, the barn, the pasture, the root cellar she had dug herself one summer with a pick and a stubborn will. All of it gone to settle what Roy owed. She understood that too. What she could not make herself understand was why 11 years of her labor hadn't purchased her at least the right to stay until spring. She spent the first day going through what was hers and what wasn't. The distinction was smaller than she'd hoped. A trunk of clothes. Her mother's cast iron skillet, which she'd brought from her mother's house, and which Roy had never questioned because he didn't cook. A folding knife. A journal her mother had kept, its pages thick with herb drawings and notes in careful handwriting. Which plants drew deer, which roots were good for fever, where the wild onion grew thickest in the creek bend. Maren had read that journal so many times she could have recited it, but she took it anyway. She also took a 10-pound sack of rye flour, because she had milled it herself from grain she'd grown in the kitchen garden, and she dared anyone to argue otherwise. On the second day, she went to see about lodging in Harwick, the nearest town 8 miles east. She walked in cold that pressed against her face like a flat hand. The boarding house had no vacancies. The livery owner said he'd heard the dry goods store might need a counter girl, but when she went there, the owner's wife looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has already decided no before you open your mouth. She walked back to the Fenwick place in the late afternoon, the light going yellow and thin across the snowfields, and she had the clear, steady feeling of a door closing. On the third day, a man named August Pryor came to the house. Maren had met August once before, briefly at a church social 2 years back. He was Roy's age, maybe older, late 50s, weathered face, not much given to talking. He ran a small horse operation 6 miles north, up past the ridge where the creek forked. His wife had died the previous winter. Maren had heard this from the minister's wife, who said it matter-of-factly, the way people say hard things about people they don't know well. August came in, declined coffee, and stood near the door the same way Roy had stood. He said he'd heard she was being put out. He said he needed someone to help manage the house and the operation, and that he could offer a small wage and a room. He said it plainly, without apology and without flattery, and she could tell from the way he said it that he expected her to say no. She said yes, not because she had no other options, though she didn't. She said yes, because the North Ridge was the one direction Roy Fenwick wasn't pointed, and because the look on August's face when she answered was not relief or satisfaction, but something quieter, the look of a man who simply needed help and had gone to the trouble of asking for it honestly. She packed her trunk that afternoon. She did not say goodbye to Roy. She left the key on the kitchen table, the way you leave something that was never really yours. The Pryor place was not what she expected. She had expected neglect, a man alone for a year, grieving and busy, letting things go. Instead, the house was clean in the stubborn, sparse way of someone who cleaned out of habit rather than care. The floors were swept. The windows were clouded but unbroken. The woodpile was adequate. What was missing was warmth, not the warmth of a fire, which burned steady and sufficient, but the warmth of a space that had been lived in with intention. August's wife, whose name Maren learned from a sampler on the wall, had been a woman named Ruth. The sampler was the only thing of Ruth's still visible in the main rooms. Everything else, the curtains, the dish towels, the things women leave in a house, had been taken down or put away, and Maren understood without being told that she was not to ask about this. She didn't ask. She set her skillet on the hook above the stove and hung her coat on the peg nearest the door and took stock of the pantry. The state of the pantry told her everything she needed to know about how August Pryor had been living. There was flour, salt pork, dried beans, a small crock of lard, and very little else. A man eating to stay alive. She baked bread that first evening, rye, and set it on the table without announcement. August came in from the barn, washed his hands at the basin, sat down, and ate without comment. But he ate 3 slices, and she noticed. The weeks that followed were quiet and structured. She learned the rhythms of the operation. The horses, 6 of them, which August bred and trained for sale. The chickens kept in a lean-to off the barn, the small root cellar behind the house that contained last year's stores. She learned that August rose before light and worked without stopping until dark and said perhaps 30 words per day, most of them about the horses or the weather. She learned that he was not a cold man, only a contained one, and that his containment was not indifference but something more like damage, the kind a man carries quietly rather than display. She learned all of this by watching, the same way she had always learned what mattered. What she had not planned on was the drought. It had started the previous summer, the summer before she arrived, and it continued into that winter in the way droughts do, invisibly, under snow, waiting. By March, when the snow should have been melting into the creek, there was not enough. By April, the creek had dropped a foot. By May, the kitchen garden she'd started in the south-facing corner of the yard was struggling on an inch of water a week, and the hay meadow that August needed to feed the horses through next winter was coming in thin and yellow. Harwick felt it too. The dry goods store began rationing flour in June. The Hendersons, who farmed the flat ground east of town, lost their corn entirely. A family named Mast sold their homestead in July and left for Oregon, and 2 other families followed by August. August said very little about any of this. He watched the sky with the particular attention of a man who has watched it for 40 years and knows what the watching does and doesn't tell you. He went on working. Maren watched him work, and she thought about her mother's journal. There was a passage in it, written in a cramped, careful hand, about a summer her mother had spent as a girl in dry country, where the creek barely ran and the garden barely grew. Her mother had written about what grew anyway, the plants that didn't need much, the weeds that turned out to be useful, wild mustard, lamb's quarters, a grass her mother called buffalo rye, which grew in the shade of the rock outcroppings and kept its seed even in a dry year. Maren had thought of it as history. She had not thought of it as instruction. She began thinking of it that way now. She started small, the shaded corner behind the barn, north-facing, where the soil stayed cooler and held moisture longer. She cleared and turned and planted with a mix of the rye grain she'd brought and some saved seeds she found in the bottom of her trunk, seeds her mother had pressed into a fold of cloth years ago and which she had carried without knowing quite why. She watered them with the dishwater, the rinse water, the water she'd otherwise have thrown out. She kept a second bucket by the door for the purpose. August watched this with the expression he used for most things, attentive, neutral, not quite curious. He didn't ask. Eventually, she told him anyway. "There's a corner behind the barn that gets no direct sun past noon," she said. "The soil's cooler there, holds moisture. I'm going to see what I can grow in it." He looked at her. "In the shade, in the shade." He nodded once and went back to the bridle he was mending. What grew was not spectacular, and it was not fast, but it grew. The rye came up thin and pale in the deep shade, thicker and greener where it caught morning sun. The lamb's quarters she found growing wild along the fence line and transplanted. Not because she'd planned to, but because one morning she looked at them and thought about all the times she'd pulled them as weeds without considering what they were, and those thrived, green and abundant, almost aggressively indifferent to the dry summer. She dried the leaves and cooked them into the beans at night. She found wild purslane along the creek bank, thick with water its stems had stored, and she harvested it for salads and for the omelets she made with the chicken's eggs. She kept a record in the back of her mother's journal, in her own handwriting, filling the blank pages her mother had left. What she planted, where, when, how much water, what survived, what didn't, what surprised her. By July, she had more rye coming in than she'd expected. Not a surplus, not enough to call it a harvest, but enough that she started baking bread again, the dense, dark loaves she'd always made, and enough that she told August over supper one evening that she thought she could coax a little more from the north-facing plot if she extended it 6 feet along the fence line. He said, "Do what you think is right." It was the most he'd said about it, and she understood it as endorsement. The bread was the thing that changed everything, though she didn't understand that yet. She baked it on Saturdays, as she always had, and twice August loaded the saddlebags and rode into Harwick for supplies, and both times she sent a loaf with him without thinking much about it. It was what you did, brought something when you went somewhere. It was manners. The second time, the storekeeper's wife, a woman named Helen Barr, stopped him on his way out to ask where the bread had come from. August told her. Helen Barr sent a note back with him. The note said, "Mrs. Holt, I've heard you've been growing rye out at the Pryor place. We haven't been able to get flour shipped from Wichita for 6 weeks. If you have more, there are families in town that would buy it. Please come see me." Maren read the note twice. Then she went out to look at the north-facing plot and at the fence line extension and at the flat ground between the barn and the creek that she'd been measuring with her eyes for 3 weeks without letting herself think about what she was measuring it for. She came in and told August she needed to talk to him about the land use. He put down his coffee and listened. She said, "I think I can grow enough to supply Harwick through the end of the drought." "Not wheat. We don't have the water for wheat. But rye doesn't need what wheat needs, and there are other things. Lamb's quarters for greens, purslane. If I can use the creek bank ground and the north side of the barn lot and the strip between the fence and the property line, I think I can produce something real." August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's 3 additional plots, yes. I was going to use that creek bank ground for a second hay cutting." "I know." Another silence. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. "How certain are you?" he said. "I'm not," she said. "But I know what I planted, and I know what grew, and I know what my mother wrote about dry summers. I'm as certain as the ground lets me be." He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at the window. He said, "All right." She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the small room at the back of the house, her room, which she had made into something resembling her own over the months, and she thought about all the ways it could fail. Too dry, too little time. The rye going thin and useless in the shade. Helen Barr's family's in town, counting on something she couldn't guarantee. But she got up in the morning, and she went out to the creek bank ground, and she started turning it. The summer wore on the way droughts do, relentlessly, without apology. The sun came up hard every morning, and the sky stayed white and still, and the creek dropped lower every week, until by August it was running in a trickle between flat stones. Maren watered everything by hand. She rose before light and pulled water from the deepest pool in the creek and carried it in 2 buckets along the fence line, and she did it again at dusk. Her hands cracked and bled in the dry heat, and she wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept going. She learned to read the plants the way her mother had written about, watching for the dullness that meant stress, the curl that meant thirst, the color that meant the root was struggling. She adjusted. She pulled back the water from the plants that were robust and gave more to the ones that were flagging, and she wrote it all down, every change, every decision. August helped in the evenings without being asked. He rigged a simple channel from the creek pool to the creek bank plot, 2 boards set at an angle, nothing complicated, but it cut her hauling time by 1/3. He didn't say anything about it. He just built it one evening while she was in the kitchen, and she saw it the next morning when she went out to water. She thanked him. He said it wasn't anything. She had learned by then that when August Pryor said something wasn't anything, he meant he'd thought about it for a while before doing it. In mid-August, she loaded the first real delivery onto the wagon. 4 sacks of rye flour she'd milled herself using a hand mill she'd found in the back of the barn and repaired over 3 evenings, and drove into Harwick. Helen Barr met her at the door of the dry goods store with the expression of a woman who has been hoping for something and isn't sure she believes it's arrived. Maren stacked the sacks on the counter and told Helen what she had and what she could supply going forward, and at what price, which she had worked out the night before to be fair without being charitable, because charity was not what she was offering. Helen Barr bought all 4 sacks and asked when the next delivery would come. Maren said, 2 weeks. On the way home, she stopped at the edge of town, where 3 women stood talking near the post office. Women she recognized from Roy's church. Women who had been present at the social, where she'd been looked at the same way she'd been looked at in that dry goods store 2 years ago. She stopped not to talk to them, but because her horse needed water, and the trough was there. One of the women, she didn't know her name, only her face, said, "Is that Maren Holt driving August Pryor's wagon?" And another one said, "I suppose it is." She let her horse drink, and then she drove home. The deliveries continued every 2 weeks through August and September. Helen Barr began putting a handwritten sign in the window on the days the wagon was expected. Rye flour, Holt's. Men who had been buying pricey shipped-in flour from 2 counties over came in on delivery days to buy hers instead. A woman named Deborah Sanger stopped Maren on the street one morning and said she'd heard there were greens available too, and could she buy some for the week? Maren began bringing the lamb's quarters and purslane wrapped in cloth. She told each person who bought them what they were and how to prepare them. Sautéed in lard, added to soup, eaten raw with vinegar. She said it matter-of-factly, without ceremony, because the information was practical, and there was nothing sentimental about feeding your family through a drought. Word got around the way word gets around in a small town, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of small observations. The flour doesn't get rationed on delivery days. The woman driving that wagon knows what she's doing. There's rye this year because someone figured out how to grow rye in the shade. Roy Fenwick came into the dry goods store one afternoon in September when Maren was making a delivery. She didn't see him at first. She was talking to Helen about the next month's supply when she heard his voice behind her, asking about flour prices. She turned and looked at him. He looked back. His expression did something complicated and then settled into blankness. She said, "Hello, Roy." He said, "Maren," and that was it. She finished her conversation with Helen, loaded the empty sacks back onto the wagon, and drove home. She did not think about it much on the drive. There was nothing to think about that she hadn't already settled inside herself. Not on a particular day, but gradually. Over the summer, the way a person closes a door, not by slamming it, but by pressing it quietly shut until the latch catches. She had lost a house and gained a purpose, and she had no use for bitterness that didn't produce anything. October brought the first real rain. A 3-day stretch that turned the creek back into a creek and soaked the soil and bent the dry grass flat. August stood on the porch the first evening of it and looked out at the rain for a long time. Maren brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him. "It'll help the hay meadow for next year," she said. "Yes," he said. "The rye's already done, but I can expand the creekbank plot next spring. More variety. I want to try some early oats and see if there's a way to get turnips going in the shaded area." He looked at her sideways. "You're staying then?" She looked at him. It hadn't occurred to her that this required saying. "If you'll have me," she said. He looked back out at the rain. His expression was the quiet one she'd come to know. Not warm, exactly, but present. Paying attention. "I'll have you," he said. In November, a woman named Frances Aldrich came out from Harwick to see the plots. Frances taught the school in town, a 1-room building with 12 students and a cold stove. She said she'd heard about what Maren had been doing and wanted to understand it, specifically for the older students, who she thought should learn something practical about growing food in a dry country. Maren showed her everything. The creekbank plot, the shaded corner by the barn, the fence line extension, the system of boards August had built for the water channel. She showed her the journal, her mother's pages, and then her own pages at the back, the record she'd kept through the summer. She explained why she'd chosen rye over wheat, why shade mattered more than people thought, why lamb's quarters was something you ate rather than pulled. Frances wrote it all down in a small notebook. She asked careful questions. When she left, she shook Maren's hand and said, "I'm going to bring the students out in the spring, if that's all right." Maren said it was all right. Walking back to the house, she passed the corner where she'd put in her first small test planting, that first desperate square of turned earth, back in May, when she didn't know whether any of this would work. The ground was bare now, resting under the November cold. But she knew what it had given, and she knew what she was going to ask of it in the spring. She went inside and added 3 lines to her journal: what she'd planted, what she'd harvested, what she was going to try next. Then she hung up her coat, washed her hands, and started supper. The iron skillet. Her mother's, the one she'd carried out of Roy Fenwick's house, because she had milled the flour and done the work, and she dared anyone to argue otherwise, was already hot on the stove. She measured out the rye. She worked the dough. The bread would be ready by the time August came in from the barn. He would sit down and eat without much comment, the way he always did. But he would eat, and the eating was what mattered, and somewhere in town, in kitchens she'd never see, other people would be eating too. From flour she'd grown in the shade of a barn on a dry country ridge. From seeds her mother had pressed into a fold of cloth and she had carried without knowing why. She pressed the loaves flat with the heel of her hand and slid them into the heat.